This game genuinely surprised me. Konami barely invested in marketing to the point that my brother had to remind me that it was finally available on PS5. Weirder still, it just appeared as a free downloadable game and it came without any microtransactions. To me, that meant that Konami had zero confidence in the product and decided to just release it because if they thought that Ascension was worth adding an in-game shop and not this, well... oh my god. To make matters even worse, my brother warned me that it had nothing to do with the Silent Hill license other than with the title. Now that I've played it though, I can confidently state that my brother was partially right, with the major difference being that this game is actually enjoyable. I love how it tries to modernize the license by mixing mediums, essentially switching between live action and pre-rendered cutscenes. The environment is also breathtaking, and I appreciate the fact that the game attempts to tell a cohesive story unlike Ascension. All combined, you can definitely see that the team was passionate about their project. There was a clear vision of what this game should be, and for what it's worth, I really appreciate it for what it is. Although, I have to stop it there and immediately mention that as good as this game is, it is actually a horrible Silent Hill game. To be more precise, this feels more like a Bloober Team game than a genuine psychological horror experience. You essentially walk around the different corridors and rooms, collecting notes in order to progress the general narrative. At the same time, your mind loses its grip with reality, which in turn reflects on the world. The game is also obsessed with relatable issues that the young generations face, with bullying, domestic abuse, and mental anxiety leading to suicidal acts being the main focus. This somehow feels more like a remake of the original Layers of Fear than the Silent Hill game, and I say that actually as a compliment. If you want to know my opinion on Bloober Team and their games, I previously made a retrospective on Layers of Fear 1 and The Observer. Please check them out if that actually interests you. Back to the short message, I can see why some people praised it. It's devoted to representing the struggles that young adults face in modern society, and it does it in a way that some are able to relate to. This game goes all in on its concepts, and if you fit the targeted demographic, I can see this resurfacing some memories, for better or for worse. As for the rest of us, there isn't much here to captivate us because the writing isn't subtle in the slightest. It's also very predictable and repetitive to the point that, even with its short runtime, it still feels padded on multiple occasions. It's for those reasons and more that I want to share my thoughts on it. This is part 2 of 2 in my Silent Hill series, where I'll be covering Silent Hill the short message in its entirety, spoiling the game as I go along. I'll be covering its story, the world building, and the lore so that at the very end, I can get my main message across, which is that Silent Hill as we know it currently is dead. By combining what I've shown in my Ascension video with this one, I want to present the change of direction that Konami took and how that vision will affect all upcoming games, including Silent Hill 2 Remake. Therefore, in order to grasp the full picture, I do recommend that you watch my part 1 video before moving on to this one. Although, it's not necessary because I'll be summarizing any part that is required, and will do my best to explain all concepts in a way that makes sense on its own. Lastly, it's important to mention that Silent Hill the short message is an extremely short game. It took me around an hour and 35 minutes to finish the game on my first playthrough, and that's with me searching every nook and cranny for all the documents. What also makes this game hard to talk about without getting into spoilers is that it isn't narratively complex. It has a few ideas that it compulsively pushes forward, making a spoiler-free discussion practically impossible in my opinion. It's for that reason that I decided to spoil the game in its entirety and cover the parts that I think are important when talking about this game. Consider yourself warned, and with all that said, I welcome you into one of the most beautiful depictions of an abandoned building that I've ever seen. We see the game through the eyes of Anita, a stereotypical young adult living in a fictional town in Germany. For some reason which is unknown to her, she wakes up in a dilapidated room with no recollection of how she even got there. As she gets up, she rapidly remembers that she went there with the goal of meeting her best friend, who has been using the few remaining blank walls as her canvas. Immediately, I can't stop myself from admiring the sheer chaos that's on display. I just love abandoned buildings, and I've visited a few with my friends, so this really hits me on a personal level. I just love how they were able to represent the passage of time by covering all the walls with a huge array of graffiti. You can almost imagine what the young adults that made these were going through as you walk along the same walls, hoping to one day leave your own mark so that someone else could feel the same way. What also helps sell the experience is a semi-random placement of junk and other unknown materials throughout the floor's layout. It sells the idea that it was accumulated over time as people came and went. There's a certain movement or pattern, if you will, to how everything was left at the time. It makes your imagination run wild, fantasizing about the different different moments that define every room, and overall, I think that the devs did a really good job at suggesting previous human activity. That's also the key word here. It's really hard to create a digital space that's able to convince you that it does harbor life without ever actually showing you any proof. It contradicts itself constantly, and it's that paradox that the game excels in. What's also cool is that the documents you find also help ground the visuals and elevate it in the eyes of the player. For example, we discovered that multiple projects rose to the challenge of modernizing the complex, but they all lost funding, essentially shattering all hope of it ever fulfilling its intended use. It therefore never had any residents in the conventional sense of the word, but it does indeed shelter the young dreamers who, in their time of need, converted the real estate as a bunker from everyday life. That's also why I think that the devs chose this setting for the story. Secluded and in ruin, it's the perfect setting to explore the negative thoughts and emotions that the young hide within themselves. It's the fear of not fitting in, the lack of acceptance by their peers, and the bullying that it ensues, the effect that social media has on the growth of those same individuals, and the way that they ultimately deal with them. COVID-19 is also mentioned on multiple occasions as one of the many factors that contributed to upping the anxiety level in modern society. As impractical as it is to ground some of your in-game lore with specifics that will become irrelevant and forgotten by most, I'm sure that it helped make everything more real and thought-provoking for some players. Although, as much as these visuals are amazing and help separate the game from its peers, it's also the first reason as to why this doesn't feel like a Silent Hill game. As beautiful as it is to explore the abandoned villa, the environment feels static and lacks any sense of discovery. One key aspect that you simply can't represent in video game form is the effect that your physical body has on the area. Those places stimulate the senses, and interacting with the remnants of the past life is often satisfying in a way that's hard to explain to someone who's never felt it. Here, it's simply just a museum. You can't really touch any objects, kick any empty cans, listen to the wind blow through the cracks of the window, or even leave any handprints on the dusty edge. It's for those reasons that the developers should have really stepped up their game and found interesting ways for us to interact with the layout. We could have, for example, pushed some debris out of the way. They could have also given us a paint spray, letting us add our own mark to the walls. Easier still, they could have just given us access to the camera on our phone. Even as those pictures wouldn't have really served any purpose, it would have encouraged the player to pay close attention to the smaller details in the landscape. It would have also reinforced the feeling that we were indeed playing as a young adult that's constantly got our face glued to her phone. It would have served as an indirect social commentary when the player realizes that he didn't see the world through the digital eye, but through the second dimension of digitalization. Obviously, they've done none of that, which is the first major reason as to why I previously compared this game to Bloober Team. They usually make beautifully rendered worlds that sell the feeling of realism quite well. They're really good environmental storytellers, and they use that talent in order to create distinct set pieces. You're therefore forced to walk from one room into another room into another room, and each one having something new to catch your eye. The plus side of this technique is that when it's done really well, it makes the experience feel closer to a roller coaster ride than an actual museum exhibit. Every room is made to stimulate you, make you feel a specific emotion, and all are tailored with the intent of satisfying our own ever-shortening attention span. The downside of all of this is that it feels staged, and if someone isn't really into it, well, you've lost them completely. Those are some of the reasons as to why all Bloober Team games are so polarizing, and it's through that vision that we can begin to understand why this game fails in the gameplay department. It rarely attempts to stimulate you, let alone entertain you, because it's too preoccupied in sharing its story with you. The game ends up feeling like what you've seen so far. It feels more like you're taking part in a visible tour guide than a space that's made to be explored and immersed in. In other words, this game clicked for me because I already had developed an interest for the setup. I didn't mind walking around the place because I enjoyed doing that in my spare time. Although, even with that disposition, this still has some pacing issues and ultimately made me feel like a shorter game would have been a lot better, which is crazy for something that's this short. The alternative would have been to put in more effort in varying the rooms and making them more distinct from one another. For example, this shot only appears one time. They don't attempt to do anything else with it, which is sad because it's one of the most memorable scenes in the game. There's also this shot here which, on top of reinforcing the story beat with direct gameplay, it also creates an emotion in the player which makes it more personal. Overall, I'd say that this game ultimately suffers from the fact that it was indeed intended as a bite-sized experience. They probably had a limited budget and time frame, so they could only really afford to make a walking sim with a few short rides along the way. When playing the game, I couldn't stop but think of what this experience could have been if they had the resources to make it a lot longer game. It's clear to me that if they did, we would have had something more interesting because they've shown that they're capable of doing it. There are moments that work here, and they happen so often that it made me wish that this was pretty much anything else. than a cheap recruitment plan for those that have heard of the license but never actually played it. This targeted demographic is also in front and center of the story. Anita came to the abandoned building to meet her friend Maya. We soon discover that she envies her and wants to be like her. She therefore started posting her own drawings on social media and would often compare her progress with Maya. This obviously led to an unhealthy obsession. She basically couldn't compete, which then motivated her to try and post pictures of herself instead. Social media is extremely important to her, and the game really makes sure to hammer that in at every chance that it gets. We'll see Anita often exchanging correspondences with her friend and another girl that will be relevant later on. We'll also read about the effects that social media has on adults her age all throughout the experience. The phone is also used as a guiding tool throughout chase sequences, giving off static every time that we're near the monster. One detail that I do really like here is the fact that the dev team decided to combine mediums and film real actors for major cutscenes. It gives the game its own unique look and feel. They also purposefully didn't lip sync the dialogue, giving it a slight Silent Hill 2 kind of vibe. Basically, as much as social media allows us to connect with the outside world, it can also be the cause of our anxiety, and that's kind of the point here. Cyberbullying and even real-life bullying is at the forefront, and the story makes it very clear that it will play a core component in the unraveling story. At the same time, the game touches on another taboo subject, which is the act of ending your own life. Gotta love pleasing YouTube, right? Anita and her two friends live in Germany, and in 2021, offing themselves came in second as the biggest cause of death under the age of 1 to 29, second only to accidents in case you were curious. Berlin, on the other hand, declared it as the #1 cause of death for the same age group. It's then no surprise that the devs would use this method as the main catalyst for the story, with Maya obviously being dead the whole time. Which means, who's been texting Anita on her phone? The first twist is that Anita buried that reality deep inside her head, kind of like what happens in Silent Hill 2. Though here, the twist comes at no surprise because the game spoils itself on multiple occasions. We're told that on top of this building being used for art, it also became a popular place to aim for the clouds, so to speak. We can also see a memorial located at the bottom of the building, so putting all the pieces together is quite easy in this case. Regardless, when her friend tells her about it, she ends up in a state of shock. It's also the cause of her panic attack, which sends her into this game's version of Silent Hill. This segment kind of reminds me of Silent Hill Shattered Memories because you immediately start sprinting and are trying to find the exit. Walls dissolve and are replaced by fences protecting whatever the team is for that chapter. The first run has the walls covered in post-its that contain harmful words that they've had to endure in recent history. Chapter 2 is all about the strain that affected Anita's and Maya's relationship, so images of both girls can be seen on the fences. Chapter 3 is all about domestic abuse, so this one visually changes the formula by morphing Anita's old house into a maze-like structure. These are fine in concept and help add the much needed variety that the game really needs, although that sort of backfires because this also creates another level of monotony. There's basically no real gameplay variety. You'll be walking a long time until you start running for story purposes. You'll then be sprinting into a bunch of branching paths while avoiding the monster. Sometimes you'll enter an area that forces you to walk instead of running, which is supposed to create some tension, but never really actually does. You'll rapidly learn that as long as you enter in all the side doors on your path, you'll never get caught and are guaranteed to escape, except this one time where the monster spawns in front of you, killing you in a spot if you're not limber. Although, the cost of death is neglected because you respawn a few seconds away and get to retry it immediately. Do that enough times and at one point you'll end up finding the exit, which then leads you back into a walking segment. To be honest, it's an alright addition to the gameplay. It's not challenging and respawning doesn't really penalize you, so I mostly enjoyed it for its visuals. Again, if I'm going to reuse one of my previous examples, this is basically the main ride of the game. These short segments act like the climax of the story. We usually discover something that shocks our protagonist, like the death of her friend for example, and that sends her into a 2-minute long chase through her version of Silent Hill. What breaks the experience for me is really the monster design. I have no idea why they thought that this human stuffed with Sakura leaves was scary because I just find it ridiculous. I don't think that they pushed the design far enough, and as much as I want to applaud them for creating a new monster that actually represents something to the protagonist, it's way too on the nose and lacks the depth that the past monsters had in the franchise. If you haven't guessed it already, this monster represents her friend. She draws people with Sakura branches growing out of their scars. It's her signature trait, so naturally, they had to create a monster that wears the same sweater and has the same petals sticking out of it. It lacks the mystery and intrigue that Pyramid Head had going for itself when its function is essentially the same. This is another instance where if the game was released without the Silent Hill license, it would have been received more favorably in my opinion. It would have still had the same issues plaguing it, but to the very least, we wouldn't be able to directly compare it with the franchise. If you disagree and you think that its design is scary, please let me know in the comment section below. I would really be interested to hear what your thoughts are on it, because honestly, I have simply no idea how people can find this disturbing in any way. Anyways, these chase sequences always lead us to the rooftop of the building. Anita finds the last art piece that her friend worked on and is immediately stricken by jealousy. She sees it as Maya's magnum opus and the piece that will essentially immortalize her in the eyes of her followers. Emotionally torn, she decides to attempt the next best possible thing, which is that if she can't beat her, she might as well join her. Anita then decides to jump off the same ledge that Maya did, hoping that her death will make someone realize that she exists. Obviously, if it ended here, Konami would get sued for glorifying the act, so Anita wakes up in the same room that she started it all. This is also the moment where she realizes that she's actually stuck in a loop. Maya texts her a cryptic message telling her that she can only break the cycle once she discovers the truth. The rest of the chapter happens as you'd expect, with us walking around the place and reading a bunch of summarized text. This chapter is centered around bullying, as I've stated previously, so we get to experience the different ways that Maya experienced it. They desecrated her art, for example, and others have trash-talked her online. Her locker was also vandalized at school, and she was accused of being a witch because her grandmother read tarot cards. I'm honestly not quite sure what happens in this regard, but if I understand it correctly, there were a few texts that mention a Japanese person putting a curse on the town when she died. Somehow, people made the link between her and Maya, so they started treating her as a freak of nature, so to speak. It's also through that suffering that we learn just how much Maya valued both Anita and the other friend that I keep mentioning indirectly. I did that on purpose because that's actually how the game treats her as well. Emily wants to support both her friends, but Anita keeps shutting her down. She didn't realize that Emily kept a close eye on her because she was too preoccupied with the jealousy towards Maya. This is also the reason why she committed suicide at the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 keeps up with the themes as we learn that Maya reached out to Emily by leaving a note in a book that she gave to Anita so that she can then pass it on to the third girl. Why leave a physical note that could have been misplaced, which is what happens here, instead of just texting it to her, is beyond me. What also happens is that Anita finds it, reads it, and ends up even more jealous because she feels left out. She then starts remembering all the times that Maya didn't really pay attention to her, essentially creating this idea that Maya was trying to steal Anita from her. She therefore decides to keep the letter and not mention it to any of the two girls. In other words, her tunnel vision made it impossible for her to realize that Maya was actually asking Emily for help. When the response was radio silence, she decided to end her own life. This means that Emily, once more, wasn't able to be there for her friend, and it's that solitude that ended up being Maya's cause of death. Although, Anita doesn't see it that way. She obviously feels like it's her fault, which then sends her back into Silent Hill for another chase sequence. At this point, it should be fairly obvious where the story is heading. I mean, we've seen this countless times before in books and movies. Chapter 3 is all about the history repeating itself and how Anita felt alone when she was a young child. Her mother neglected her and abused her, locking her and her baby brother in the closet for hours on end until it led to his death. He died from dehydration, and the mom tried to hide the evidence by putting the toddler into a freezer. Anita essentially never had any love or affection from her mother and therefore felt lonely on her life. She also never felt supported or appreciated, so this chapter is obviously an attempt to rectify that notion. Side note, I want to mention that this game also succeeds in spoiling this part with a little book that you can find at the beginning of chapter 1. You can find a book about 27 minutes into the game that tells you why Maya was drawing Sakura branches on people. It explains that it's her way of showing that past traumas don't define a person and that overcoming them will allow the individual to prosper. If you read the chapter above that one, it talks about a girl who created a dissociative personality because of the abuse that she had to endure when she was younger. As the story mainly revolves around those two girls and that the game lacks subtlety in any way, it's quite obvious that this paragraph talks about Anita. This touches on the wider problem, which is that on top of the story being predictable and somewhat cliche, it also contains documents that either lack substance or are extremely on the nose to the point that it makes them annoying to read. Here's a detailed example which is representative of most documents in the game. Early on, you can find this book which talks about how some teams took part in a survey that explores the influence of social media in their everyday lives. Most mentioned that they felt anxiety towards not getting any likes on their posts. Those same people would then try to compensate by publishing some savory pictures of themselves. The document then continues by stating that these acts are caused by their low self-esteem and that the likes on their posts were perceived as their way of getting positive reinforcement. This is all well and good, but what peeves me the most is that that no research is actually provided, even if the whole paragraph wants you to take its word for it. How many teenagers were interviewed for this research? What's their age range? What country were they even from? What's the percentage of teens that disagreed with those claims? Here are some statistics that were published in 2018, which states that 2.6% of all German teens were addicted to social media apps like WhatsApp, Instagram, and Snapchat. That equals to around 100,000 people, with the majority being girls for some reason. To be more precise, 3.4% of girls were confirmed to be social media addicts, with the lesser 1.9% being the opposite sex. Interestingly enough, those same girls also spend more time on social media, with the average being around 3.5 hours a day. What's even more intriguing is that 1 out of 3 teens that were indeed diagnosed with social media disorder was also diagnosed with depression. Do also keep in mind that these numbers are now out of date as they're pre-COVID and more people take part in some form of online activity every day. I therefore presume that these stats should be slightly higher as the social media was really the only way to stay in touch at the time, so more took on the habit of taking part in it. This is what I mean when I say that the text in the game have no substance. I've actually taught you more about this subject in this short time period than the whole game does in its entirety. It's constantly like this, and I think that it's the main reason as to why the ending and the overall message ends up missing its mark on the player. When Anita decides to not jump from the rooftop at the end because she finally realizes that Emily was there for her and always will be to support her, we're just happy that it ended so that we can actually move on to something else. If it was better written, left a few things to interpretation, and tried to present this story in a less typical way, I think it would have been an experience that would have reached a lot more people. At its core, this game has good intentions. It talks about real issues that plague our society in a way that's easily relatable and accessible. The problem is that it doesn't really invest itself in anything specific, and therefore feels more like it took a minuscule step in the right direction. I think that this is another issue that comes with this very short runtime. This game attempts a lot by creating a 3-act story where it has a bunch of rendered cutscenes and live action ones. It wants to talk about bullying, social media related anxieties, domestic abuse, and more, but that's actually the thing. In a game where every second counts, it ends up having too much going for itself and therefore doesn't push any of its concepts far enough. All combined, it creates a game that has no replay value. There's nothing really to learn because it has nothing concrete to say. The end result is a story that feels pretty generic at its worst, with its saving grace being that it's free to play. It's therefore easy to pick and experience the only thing that's really worth mentioning, which is the layout that they created. As someone who enjoys the games made by Bloober Team, I can say that overall, the first experience was fun enough. It just lacks those strong set pieces that make the game for me, which in turn makes it hard to recommend to anyone over another game. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for. What the hell does this have to do with Silent Hill? Why does the story of 3 young girls located in a fictional town in Germany have to do with the town that we hold dear to our hearts? Well, there's a single document that mentions Silent Hill in the whole game, and it's located at the beginning of Chapter 3. I want to read it to you in its entirety because it's the missing piece to my puzzle. It allowed me to understand not just how this game fits in the canon, but how Ascension fits in as well. The text reads as follows. The Silent Hill phenomenon. The suicide rate has increased around the world, in large part due to the struggles brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, with countries still unsure of how best to handle the issue. These trying times have also given rise to a strange phenomenon in many areas. Those affected suddenly claim to see fog, even on fair weather days, and lose consciousness shortly after. This has come to be known as Silent Hill phenomenon, named after a similar event that occurred in an anonymous US town. The first to propose a theory why this would be happening is Dr. XXX, a social psychologist at the porn industry. Okay. A social psychologist at the XXX University who had the following to say on the matter. To one who is psychologically unstable, fog represents uncertainty and sensory illusions. When in a state of high stress, one's vision may become obscured and tunneled as if one is wandering through a dense fog or mist. Societal uncertainty and apprehension about the future manifest as fog, thus blurring the line between illusion and reality. As time goes on, we've seen more and more cases of the Silent Hill phenomenon. In response, response, Dr. XXX calls for a rapid rebuilding of society, as well as a stronger emphasis on counseling and mental health care for the young. Let me summarize what we just read. COVID-19 was so horrible, worse than any previous remarkable period in history, that it single-handedly created the Silent Hill phenomenon. Forget that all genocides that humans have inflicted on one another. Forget the brutality of World War II and the savagery of Genghis Khan's armies, the famines that turned respectable people into cannibals, and more. The human population certainly didn't have as much to worry about back then. So when COVID-19 hit, the collective consciousness birthed what XXX dubbed the Silent Hill phenomenon. That's why people phase in and out from Silent Hill in Ascension, and why two people from two different continents can be in the same location. It's no longer attached to a town because it has evolved as being a mental state. All you have to do is get a person to be in distress and boom, you might just end up in Silent Hill. This also means that they can milk this concept like crazy because anything can get you into that realm. A bad trip on a drug overdose could potentially put you in Silent Hill. Breaking up with your second half might have the same result. Hell, eating too much spicy food could potentially bring you to Silent Hill's doorstep. Imagine a Silent Hill game where the protagonist is on the toilet bowl. The fluids are burning him and he's sweating like crazy. He also knows that he has a weak system that barely tolerates it, but nah, what's the worst that can happen, right? Instant regret. That physical pain and anguish could potentially bring him to Silent Hill if the experience is strong enough. I'm joking, of course, but I wouldn't actually put it past Konami. They've just altered the lore to the point that they can turn any story into a Silent Hill title. As long as there's conflict, they can make the world transform for whatever reason and then slap onto it that money-making title. I think that's also why they made this game free on PS5. This is just a sneak peek at what's in store, a demo in order to recruit the mainstream crowd in buying their next games at the current market value. This then leads me to answering why Konami decided to come back in such a fashion. If you've seen my end of the year video, you already know the answer to that question. I also highly encourage that you watch it if you want an in-depth review of the current gaming market. I talk about the defining events that shaped all AAA companies, including their video game sales, financial issues, PR bullshit, general manipulations of their sale numbers, and so much more. In that same video, I have a short segment where I talk about Konami, so do check it out if you do want more information on the subject. The brief summary is that Konami isn't in the best financial situation. Their revenue has stagnated, which is fine for the short term, but far from ideal if you want to grow and prosper. They then rebranded and made a huge push towards the Western market by greenlighting any and all projects that they could. We already saw what Ascension and the short message looked like, but there's also the disappointing port of the first 3 Metal Gear games. Instead of updating it for the modern market, they just ported it without really fixing or changing anything, which is unacceptable in a world where Resident Evil remakes exist. In total, they greenlighted 5 Silent Hill games and 1 movie. They also released a lot of merchandise, essentially flooding the market with anything that they could be sold for the general population. On top of all that, they also decided to port the old Metal Gear games and start working on the next game of the series. Let me remind you that all of these were announced in less than 2 years, which is crazy because the last time we heard of them was from Metal Gear Survive, which released in 2018. They essentially now need that mainstream appeal, which is why they released Ascension and the short message. They're clearly trying to adapt the license to the new generation of gamers, and in no way is the intent clearer than by analyzing the Silent Hill 2 remake combat trailer. The way that James moves, how the camera is placed behind him, and the aggressive nature of the combat really reminds me of the Resident Evil games. Capcom made so much money from the license that I'm sure that Konami noticed and asked Bloober Team to replicate it in Silent Hill 2. There's a reason why Capcom has 2 teams currently working on Resident Evil games, and why they're essentially planning on remaking all of those that have nostalgic value. If you want more information on the matter, I talked extensively about it in the same video that I mentioned previously, so do check it out if that have interest to. As for Konami, well, I don't really blame them for copying Capcom. I mean, they essentially kept the genre alive throughout the years, and they have a pretty stable fan base that's looking forward to playing all their games. The same can't be said for the old school survival horror genre, which, with very few exceptions, well, has been reserved for the indie space. If they properly remade the second Silent Hill game, I don't think they would have been as successful as they needed it to be. The original Silent Hill games are slow, minimalistic in all aspects, but compensate by creating a world that feels bigger than the player. At the same time, they aren't combat orientated, which means that you can easily avoid the enemies in order to immerse yourself in the lore and the puzzles. Plus, at the same time, other players were trying to emulate it, so we kept getting games like Obscure, Rule of Rose, Fatal Frame, Hunting Grounds, and more being released to the public. Well, minus Rule of Rose, but that's a story story for another video. Nowadays, it's a totally different story, which is why it makes sense to me that they want to change the license for what is proven to work. It also makes even more sense when you recall that Silent Hill was originally created as Konami's answer to Resident Evil. Team Silent was asked to create a replica of Resident Evil, but they had other plans and convinced the board to do something else. Silent Hill roots have always been intertwined with Resident Evil, so it makes sense that they would try to emulate it once more, essentially now that they need money and that the franchise has sustained itself pretty well throughout the years. Although, let's not forget that I'm judging it based on the trailer that was created without Bluebird Team's cooperation. Konami made it with the provided footage, which means that they might have purposefully made the trailer more aggressive than it actually is. Regardless, it just saddens me to see that overall, they don't really seem to care about the quality of their products. The short message was indeed an okay game, but the contribution that it brings to the canon are honestly horrible. Ascension shouldn't have existed in my opinion, and now Silent Hill 2 will probably end up being an okay game that feels more like a clunky Resident Evil than a proper remake. Bluebird Team had never done a third-person shooter, so the pressure is on to see if they can prove themselves and create something that plays as smoothly as we're accustomed to playing nowadays. One can only hope that it's as good as we all hope, but honestly, I'm sort of losing hope here. We definitely can't trust Konami, so I'm hoping that we can, to the very least, trust Bluebird Team. For what it's worth, they promised that they would keep the story intact and only upgrade the visuals and the combat, so it shouldn't be that bad, right? And that's the end of that. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you really liked it. And do let me know in the comments if you're actually gonna get the new Silent Hill 2 remake. I would be really interested to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you for making this gamer's dream a reality. I wish you the best, and I'll see you soon. Bye now.